Stranger Arena was an unreleased game Lorne Lanning spoke about in depth in an article with Eurogamer in 2014. The idea of it was to use the mechanics Oddworld Inhabitants had built for Oddworld Strangers Wrath and create a competitive multiplayer experience out of that. Although this just sounds like an idea they might have had, a working prototype of it was actually built. Lorne Lanning said, "We had it running, Stranger Arena. You were using stranger mechanics, but you were going head to head with other strangers. You were doing multiplayer platforming and first person shooting, so the dynamics of strangers and arenas head to head. I have to say, we were really excited about this." This does sound like a really exciting idea and certainly one that would have been really fun to play. There's never been a properly multiplayer Oddworld game, so the idea of essentially just taking Strangers Wrath gameplay and converting it to allow multiple people to play it and fight each other sounds really interesting, especially when you consider the unique gameplay of Strangers Wrath. There's no other game that I know of that has gameplay like that, so it certainly would be an interesting experience. And indeed, Lorne continues by explaining how they designed the Strangers Wrath gameplay the way it was in order to create a more dynamic experience that you don't generally get in competitive FPS first-person shooters. One of the reasons we built the Strangers mechanics this way was because in third person I could run much faster. I had a melee ability. I couldn't, but I could run. So if I chose not to shoot and I chose to be in third person, I could run and outmaneuver them. You had evasion capabilities. That's what you didn't have in most of these head-to-head games. In Quake or Doom, you were either winning or you were losing, but you didn't have much strategy in between. I was looking for more strategy in how I want to play the character. Like if I'm dealing with people who are obviously tougher than me, then I want to be more clever. I don't want to be losing just because they're faster on the draw. You're not going to beat them by being clever, you're going to beat them by playing as many hours as they do. As a result, it seems that Lorne Lanning took great inspiration from RTS real-time strategy games, and I suppose Stranger Arena was sort of like a mashup between an RTS and an FPS, combining the mechanics of a shooter with the strategy of an RTS. He said, "What I wanted to do was do what they do in RTS games." Apparently he said that in RTSs he'd often win matches by slowly and methodically focusing on defensive base building, indicating that quickness does not always equal victory in this genre. So, like, as opposed to shooters where whoever is quick enough to hit their target first wins, you can choose to be more methodical and strategize in your gameplay style, and that's an element he wanted to replicate with Stranger Arena. And hearing this makes me think, if Stranger Arena was to implement this sort of base building element, which I'm not certain that's what Lorne is saying, I think he's just referring to RTS games in general, but it for some reason reminds me a bit of what I've heard of a game I've never played before, so take this observation with a grain of salt, or don't, it's up to you. The game Rust. It slightly reminds me of Rust in terms of, apparently, I've been told you have to like build up a base and defend it from people and that kind of thing, which I guess you could say that about lots of games actually, but just it seems sort of like a shooter, but more dynamic and with more strategy from what I've heard. But yeah, I don't know, just a thought I had. Stranger Arena sadly didn't make it to ever being released due to Oddworld Strangers Wrath selling badly, which Lorne blames the publisher EA for, saying they didn't market it, and as a result being disillusioned with the traditional video game publishing models, Oddworld Inhabitants shut down shortly afterwards. Lanning explained further what the company's plan at the time had been, including at what stage Stranger Arena was expected to come out. Coming out of 2005, our hope was to go from Strangers Wrath to Stranger 2.0 to Stranger 2.5 Stranger Arena. Now it's interesting that Lorne says Stranger 2.0. Now my opinion when he says this here, I don't think he means a direct sequel like Oddworld Strangers Wrath 2. I think he just means the next game that would be an evolution of the Strangers Wrath gameplay and mechanics. But interestingly, I've always taken the concept of Strangers Wrath 2, a direct sequel to Strangers Wrath, as always being sort of like a myth. A concept that was never really intended, an idea that exists simply because Strangers Wrath received a highly positive reception, and so people would like a follow-up. But as far as I was aware anyway, Strangers Wrath was conceived as a standalone game with a standalone story that ended with that game. Or at least Stranger's story was done. And I mentioned in my Fangus Clock video that I did that there were discussions at the time about a sequel to Strangers Wrath, which ended up turning into the brutal ballad of Fangus Clot, but I've always taken it that the idea of a direct sequel, Strangers Wrath 2, never really reached past that point. There was a poll on the official Oddworld website back in the day, 2013, that asked fans what game they wanted Oddworld Inhabitants to do next, and Strangers Wrath 2 was one of the options, as well as Fangus. And the poll showed a great deal of support for the prospect, with the option for a Strangers Wrath sequel garnering 14% of the vote and coming third, which is quite impressive. So there was definitely a great desire for it seems. But likewise, I just sort of took this as them seeing how strongly people would want that in theory, as opposed to it actually being something they were genuinely considering. However, I had a quick look just now to see if there's any information that contradicts my perception that I've always had of the probability and realism of a Strangers Wrath sequel, and the only thing I found was an interview with Just Add Water by official Xbox Magazine UK in 2013, in which Stuart Gilray said, "Lorne and I spoke about it 5-6 months ago and nothing happened." Which, by the way, I just realised looking at the dates that might have been around the time they did the poll. Stuart then continued saying, "And then in November we all said, what's this Strangers Wrath 2 idea you had? And he sent me an email about a mile long and I'm like, oh my god." So I've read bits of it. He's got a whole premise out for Stranger 2 and it is something we have considered doing. So it seems that there is a definitive idea for a Strangers Wrath sequel, which is really interesting. I do wonder if that's been something Lorne has had in his mind for a long time, since before the original game came out, or whether it's a relatively newer idea, like after seeing the enduring popularity of Strangers Wrath, and seeing how much everyone liked it and would like a sequel to it, maybe that got Lorne's mind working on ideas for a sequel. A bit like the way The Last of Us was only ever meant to be one game. That was it. It was a standalone game that told a story that ended with that game. That was all there was ever meant to be. It was only because it was so successful that they then made a sequel, but that was never originally intended. The article goes on to speculate about features that may have been in the Strangers Wrath sequel, stating, "As for how a Strangers Wrath 2 might play, that could be a question of what didn't make it into the original. Gilray cites a few breeds of live ammunition that were eventually dumped by Oddworld Inhabitants. There was a porcupine one, which is basically like the hedgehog grenade in Resistance Fall of Man. You couldn't do that on the original Xbox, it would have killed the frame rate to do it properly." Of course, it's important to note that this article, despite not even being a decade old, was in a very different period of Oddworld's development than they're at in 2022. And considering Oddworld Inhabitants are now going with the Oddworld Soulstorm new quintology route, it makes me wonder if the intention is now for Lorne's ideas for Strangers Wrath 2 to be adapted and implemented into the next game after Soulstorm in this new series, as Lorne said nearly a year ago that Stranger will play a role in it. It surely will be interesting to see what the future holds for the Stranger. Though there was definitely places to go with a direct Stranger sequel. Mr. Secto was still alive, and although I've previously theorised that this story element may have been intended to be reprised in the Oddworld quintology, it would also be an obvious place to go for a sequel to Strangers Wrath instead. Secto starts up his dodgy dealings again, or maybe outright tries to get revenge on Stranger, and you'd have to go beat him up. It'd be interesting to find out what plans Lorne Lanning did have for the sequel. But back to Stranger Arena. So Lorne said, coming out of 2005, our hope was to go from Strangers Wrath to Stranger 2.0 to Stranger 2.5, Stranger Arena. Reason I went off on a tangent about Oddworld Strangers Wrath 2 was because I was saying, when he said Stranger 2.0, I wonder if he actually means Strangers Wrath 2 or just the next game that was an evolution of Strangers Wrath gameplay, which in my mind would have probably been Fangus Clot, as that would have been built and been an evolution of the engine that was utilised by Strangers Wrath. So Fangus Clot could have technically been considered Stranger 2.0 arguably. Especially when you consider what I said earlier about potentially Strangers Wrath 2 may be a more recent idea, so wouldn't have been on Oddworld Inhabitants' radar at the time. So here when he says Stranger 2.0, I think he might be referring to Fanger's Clot, though as I said I could be wrong, but to me it feels like if he was talking about a sequel of Stranger, he'd probably say Stranger 2, but instead he specifically said Stranger 2.0, suggesting, I would argue, that he's talking about the evolution of the gameplay as opposed to the evolution of the story. And likewise, I also think that, despite the working title, I doubt Stranger Arena would have actually been a Stranger game, as in literally just Stranger's Wrath converted to multiplayer. That's potentially what they had at the time and what they built it as for the prototype probably, but I'd imagine they'd have changed it quite a bit if they actually released it. Like I personally doubt you'd have played a stranger literally fighting against other strangers in the final game. They probably would have changed the characters and that kind of thing, I'd imagine. Maybe, considering it was called Stranger Arena, it would have been like the Fanger's Clot slave fighting arenas that were planned to play a part of that game. I could be wrong of course, just a consideration I thought worth mentioning. But of course, Stranger's Wrath was revived by Just Add Water when they made the HD remake for the PlayStation 3 in 2011, which begs the question, could Stranger Arena, a multiplayer mode, have been added to it? To which Lorne Lanning said, "We'd like to, but that engine was built for the first Xbox at that time. Because of that, there's a bit of re-architecting. We have to think very conservatively because it's our money. There's no deep pockets anywhere. Can we bring Stranger Arena into Unity? Of course the answer is yes, but the question is how much would it cost?" You know, I wouldn't be surprised if people could actually mod Stranger's Wrath to be multiplayer somehow. I mean, I think it'd be extremely difficult, but I'm pretty sure it'd be possible. I've been watching videos of that new Five Nights at Freddy's game that just came out. It's a single player game, it's only been out a month and a half as of me writing this, and people have already modded it to make it multiplayer. You know, I mean, I'm pretty sure that had never happened with Stranger's Wrath, but I'm just saying, I reckon it'd be possible to do that. But ultimately, for Oddworld Inhabitants, it all comes down to expense. They have to be careful what they choose to do, and a multiplayer experience I think is really expensive for a game studio to create, so it'd definitely be a massive risk for them to do something like that. But Lorne did say Stranger Arena is still something we'd really like to do, so bearing in mind that this article was done about 8 years ago, who knows what the future holds. The framework and design is there at least, so it'd certainly be interesting to see what future role the Stranger and Stranger Arena could play in future Oddworld games.
Hello, follow me.